also in recovery, and we are trying very actively to form a institutionally recognized and supported collegiate recovery program here at Columbia. And I also direct a 50 student employee organization called Columbia Artists as Teachers, also through the School of the Arts, which is a social justice teaching organization that brings creative writing opportunities to mental health organizations and especially to a lot of folks who are in recovery.
My name is Noel. I'm an assistant professor at the Boston University School of Public Health. Real briefly, similar to Morgan, I grew up in the a Portland suburb of Vancouver, Washington. Dissimilar to Morgan, I veered towards methamphetamine rather than opiates, but was severely addicted to methamphetamine for probably 7 or 8 years. And that ended up in me going to prison for 7 years from 2002 to 2009. Very lucky to have been at a prison that had a college in prison program. And so got my feet wet or dipped my toe in college and gave me the inspiration, just enough inspiration to go to the local community college when I got out. And really just stayed in school until I saw an off-ramp to a career that I felt like would be an opportunity for me to take care of my family. And so I just spent 4 years doing a postdoc at Stanford, where I also was the resident fellow for the substance-free housing unit, which houses the Collegiate Recovery program there, and also have a grant to study collegiate recovery programs.
My name is Tom Bannard. I am the Assistant Director for Recovery Support at Virginia Commonwealth University, so I work really closely with John over the last decade, and I am a person in recovery, and so for me that means that things were really dark in December of 2006 during my undergraduate experience. Had a number of consequences, including legal consequences connected to my addiction, and because it was a pretty dark place, and I was very fortunate to have access to long-term recovery supports, some quality treatment, and so kind of that experience kick-started a career in working with substance use and recovery and addiction, and so I've been working in this space since 2007, and spent the first half of my career working with folks experiencing homelessness and addiction, and then have been at the Collegiate Recovery program at VCU since 2015. And I have a 1-year-old daughter now as a gift of recovery. We didn't have met. She's rolling around here somewhere, so I apologize if she interrupted the last panel at all. But that's been such a gift of recovery to be a dad in recovery, and and for her to have to be a part of a really wonderful recovery community has been a real gift.
My name is Kristine de Jesus. I use she, they pronouns. I am the executive director of Students Recover, which is the first online student recovery community in the nation. That came out of the beautiful gift of being at Princeton, doing a fellowship that allowed me the time to develop this organization. Prior to that, I worked at Montclair State University as a counselor in their college counseling center and co-led the collegiate recovery community there. I do not identify as a person in recovery. I'm definitely more in the advocacy realm, and I'm really glad to be here with you all today.
Oh, thank you. Guess I should say, so I'm Keith Murphy, he, him, is. So, in thinking about, the folks here on the panel and one having like a long time with some folks like in my life, which is really amazing. But you all have experience with some capacity collegiate recovery. What is collegiate recovery to you? First, define it if you can, or if you would.
I would say I would defer to Caleb as the resident student.
Well,
Thank you. Okay, so to give a little bit of context for folks, I originally attended a community college when I graduated high school in 2010. I was already very much in a state of active addiction that was controlling my life. My relationship with substances began when I was 13. By the time I was going to college at 17, it had just progressed for 4 years straight. So I went to a community college. There was no collegiate recovery program there. I spent the year at the community college prepping to transfer to Michigan State University, which was a state university. And I pinned a lot on that. I thought that that would really do a lot for me. And I got there, and I only lasted a semester. My mental health declined rapidly. My substance use accelerated rapidly. I was within a month of being at that state university, like basically unable to leave my dorm room. I wasn't attending my classes anymore. I would get up at about 8 o'clock at night to go to the apartment with the people that I would use with. And that's pretty much where I lived. And by the end of that first semester at Michigan State, where there was no collegiate recovery program at all, I had failed all of my classes and I had to leave school. And I also worked for the university. I had my housing through the university. I lost all of that when I left school. And the only person that opened up their home to me was my best friend who I was using with. And that's where I landed. You know, I left school and I lived on a couch and I used for the whole, that was it for the whole next year. I say that to say that those were my first experiences with being in college, and there was no collegiate recovery program. I had never heard of it. I did not believe, I'd never even heard the word recovery back then, by the way. All I knew was the word alcoholic, which is not a word that I like and not a word that I would use to identify myself. But that's what I knew. That was the language. And flash forward, I guess, to what collegiate recovery actually looks like is that when I came back to school, and I'm sure I'll talk more about this, but I came back to school because of my recovery years later, that was something I really cared to do. And I was very fortunate to be able to re-enroll in a community college while I was actually actively in recovery. And that made a huge difference. I 4-pointed my time at community college. Like, that was me getting support, you know? And when I transferred out of that community college, I transferred to a 4-year university, Montclair State University, had a collegiate recovery program. And the difference that was immediate. Before I ever even set foot on that campus, I had already attended a collegiate recovery meeting. I already knew that there were other students on that campus that were in recovery with me, that there were staff that were dedicated just to thinking about students like myself and making sure that we had what we needed. And I honestly believe that that is why I was able to succeed. Yeah, so I guess what is collegiate recovery? I guess it can be a lot of things, but like, it's intentionally providing services that focus on and prioritize students that are in recovery at institutions of higher ed.
Yeah, everything that Caleb said, because he did a great job of explaining it. And I will give a very academic answer in saying that it is any type of service or resources for college students in recovery.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm a little conflicted about this question because I think that what I've seen is that I've seen a number of schools that have really awesome, hardworking, dedicated groups of students that are doing amazing work in a kind of mutual aid space, in a kind of club like kind of space. And I think it's really cool and it's really needed and it's important. And I've also seen things like what Kristine is doing in terms of, creating these virtual spaces for students to engage, largely at schools that don't have formal structure support. And I think as a person that's very fortunate to be working at a school that's invested intentionally in students in recovery in substantial ways. I'm a little bit biased towards saying that collegiate recovery programs from an institutional perspective means that the school has invested staff and space into their students in recovery, that they have made a substantial and lasting and institutionalized investment in their students that have severe substance use disorder. And that is fundamentally something a little bit different than students doing an incredible job creating their own community and doing everything they can do to survive addiction and to thrive despite the lack of institutional supports. And so I guess it's not, to me, it's not, it's not about kind of like, yes, recovery that's happening on college campuses in some ways is collegiate recovery, but from a person who wants students to have robust supports, I think there's something really important about naming that. There are schools that are intentionally investing in students in recovery, and there are schools that are not. And that there's something fundamentally different about those two things. And so I don't want schools that are not doing their own work around recovery issues to go out and say that they have a collegiate recovery program because they have some awesome students that are working on recovery on their campus. I don't know if that makes sense, but I just feel like that needs to be said.
Oh, I can continue on there with you because I can. So yeah, I think talking about collegiate recovery is a very nuanced topic. And I think, I'm going to say and do a little, making people uncomfortable, and that's all right, because that's what I do. Therapist by training, we can sit with it. There are colleges that claim to have collegiate recovery communities, like the one I used to work at. And what they really have is people who love and are dedicated to their students. And they create a community within the college that supports recovery. But that is not a collegiate recovery community, right? Like that is individuals creating space similar to what you're talking about with students, right? This is an institutionalized program of support. And I think we need to be really intentional in our discussions and our language and how we talk about recovery supports on college campuses and what they do and how they live. Because many colleges offer collegiate recovery programs in name, but actually don't provide the care and the support. And many colleges don't offer collegiate recovery programs in name, but provide a community of support and care where students can thrive. And so I think we need to be really thoughtful in these discussions about what collegiate recovery is. And, in the work I do, because I'm not in a college, I don't provide collegiate recovery. And yet we provide supports for students in recovery. We call them student recovery communities because we're centering the student and not the college. So I think it's really important to have intentional, nuanced language when we're discussing these things and really parcel out what we're asking.
Yeah, well, thank you. Other thoughts, please.
I would love to add on, and I agree with everything everybody has said. And I'm going to name it that we are sitting right now at a university that is doing exactly what is being discussed. As a student who is in recovery here at Columbia, there is absolutely, without question, no actual institutional collegiate recovery program at all. It does not exist here. What there is a group of students, some of whom are here right now, dedicated to making this event happen, that are on their own taking the initiative to gather, to create a WhatsApp, to have a group space where we can communicate with each other. We've had difficulties finding just a regular, solidified space to meet. Until this year, there was one location for 2 meetings that were happening back to back, and that was it. And trying to find a second location to hold a second meeting that wasn't just a 12-step meeting was so hard. And the only reason that it happened is because I am unfortunately in a role now with my staff position here where I can request to have rooms. But that's it. There's not a staff person advocating for us. There's not institutional support. There's not institutional funding. There's not a designated location. There's none of that. And yet, Columbia continues to say, no, there's a Columbia recovery community, literally being entirely run by students, all run by students. It does not have institutional support. That is not a collegiate recovery program. Just want to name it.
Thanks for that. So there's a lot here that we kind of assume here in terms of we talking about collegiate recovery. And I always like to go back to basics and just to kind of give us a basic understanding. And one of the things that we haven't really talked about is like, what are we talking about when we talk about recovery? Oh. Put that all to you. I know. So
I'm happy to, if anybody else would like to say something first.
And I want to tie into my other follow-up, just so for the sake of clarity. And you kind of hinted at it earlier, Caleb, but like just an idea here for when we talk about recovery and what that means. I don't think we're coming at it from maybe the same lens, the same perspective, or the same understanding, because it can mean so many different things to so many different people. So, and Kristine, you don't have to, you could just,
Yeah, I'm going to just hop in on there. So when we look at recovery, at least to me, in a recovery lens in higher education, I think largely what we're talking about is abstinence-based recovery from substance. I'm not going to say that's every program's lens, but I would say, with my dear friends who are professionals in the field, I would say that's largely where we're talking about. And I will say very intentionally that the program I developed at Montclair and the program I'm developing with Students Recover is not that. And so, to me, when we talk about recovery, people recover from many different things. But when we talk about substance use, my lived experience, and I'm speaking from that lens, is that people don't develop substance use issues out of nowhere. There's usually other things going on in life. And that if we don't address things like mental health, the impact of capitalism, and all of these other nuanced ways in which the quality of life in the United States impacts people's being in the world, then we are not able to create truly spaces that can inform people's well-being in recovery. And so I think we need to be really intentional about how we talk about recovery. I know I keep saying we need to be really intentional, but we do. Damn it. We need to be thoughtful. And so, the collegiate recovery space that largely exists in the United States is abstinence-oriented. It's very Eurocentric in nature. And it doesn't address largely mental health. And in fact, there's a lot of gatekeeping, I'm going to say. And I know I'm pissing people off, and that's okay. That's what I do. But if we're talking about really creating communities of care and recovery, I think we need to be thinking from that lens of harm reduction. I think we need to be thinking about mental health and well-being. We need to be talking about the ways in which capitalism and colonization impact our ability to function in culture. And that's not what recovery, in my experience, has so much been in higher ed. And so I'm just going to put that out there and leave that there, and y'all can do with it what you want.
I'll definitely say that I come from this aspect, generally thinking kind of through the disease model, right? So with any disease, you have kind of buckets of money that are set aside for prevention, for treatment, and for recovery. And so I always try and think of all of those things, but I always try to remember that, the recovery phase of any disease is that kind of the post-treatment type of services for recovery. And again, I think that recovery is, there's a lot to that, but from a purely like disease model, and I think that, especially in this country, you've seen that ignored a lot. If it were any other disease, if it were cancer, that recovery phase is one of the most important phases. And so I think that it's been ignored both in kind of the way we funnel services and money, but then also it's been ignored in research, and that just extends to collegiate recovery, in that it's really been ignored by the research arm of things. And so that's how I try to look at it.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, and I really appreciate what Kristine said, and some of the conversations around um, what does it look like in collegiate recovery spaces to include folks who still have a relationship with substances other than nicotine and caffeine, right? And that's been, I think, a place where there's been some significant movement in the space over the last 5 years, certainly within our program. That's been really good. When I think about our services focus around students that have really, first, students that are in recovery from severe substance use disorders, and also around other students that have severe substance use disorders that that are willing to engage in services with us. And I think there's lots of things we can do to encourage people to be willing to engage with services with us. So our services are really trying to center folks that have severe substance use disorders. And while most of our staff is qualified to work with people with mental health disorders from a peer perspective, my experience in higher ed has been that, it's interesting that counseling services tend to be a little bit more territorial with things other than substance use. And with substance use, they're like, we're not very good at this, so yeah, do whatever. And like, we don't really want to deal with folks that have severe substance use disorders. I mean, if you look at the research on collegiate recovery, 90+% of folks that are in collegiate recovery program have passed severe substance use disorder. So we're not talking about folks that had one too many beers one time at a party. It's folks that have really serious issues. There's high rates of past overdose, high rates of past incarceration. And so how do you make sure that your services work for folks that are in those categories? And for one consideration is that many folks are abstinent especially from drugs other than caffeine and nicotine, right? And that is very important to them, that students will often identify that as saying, this is crucially important to me. And also, there are people who are in recovery who still have a relationship with substances other than caffeine and nicotine. That recovery is really an identity. And, you're in recovery if you say you're in recovery, and it's about a healing journey and a healing process. So, so it's really important that we have ways that we include folks in our community, in these kind of healing spaces that we have, who identify as recovery, who are recovery curious, who still are using substances. And in some ways, it's a little weird to me, as somebody that has background in 12-step, how defensive we are around that, because we've always had folks in our spaces that are using substances, and then we have traditions around including people. So, I don't know. I think that figuring, that there's a real path forward, and that we can have about thinking about how do we make this something that's accessible for more folks, because these are, I think, robust healing communities in many places. And
yeah, I'd love to add on to what's been said. And I think thinking about the recent experiences that I have lived as a student in recovery too, thinking about what else recovery support means, because I think all of you have given a great definition of what recovery can mean, and how open it really is, and how personal it is, But, I think, and Kristine, I'm totally stealing this from something I saw you share on Instagram, so please. But it's, this idea that we need to be aware of who the students are as whole people, because so many of our students that are in recovery, myself included, are people who are also extremely economically vulnerable, are people who have very heavy trauma that they're carrying with them that can be reopened up from many different interactions. These are experiences that I'm living, right? Like, I just last week was sitting in an office with admin at the school fighting to get them to release financial aid to students because they had messed up our processing delay. I had no money. And I was sitting here, like, telling these people who know that I'm a student in recovery, who know that I'm a student with mental health conditions that I'm actively having to seek support for, begging them to just hear that students need money to be able to take care of their basic living needs. And I saw Kristine share this wonderful thing, that said, like, food security is suicide prevention, right? Like, financial security is suicide prevention. These are harm reduction services as well, right? Like, we have to be aware of who our students are that are in these spaces. And it's not just, oh, well, that person has a relationship with substances. It's, we have many aspects of our lives that deserve specific attention and support. And those areas are frequently, I think, not being understood as being related to our recovery. Like, if I don't have money, I cannot access my individual therapy. I didn't have that all summer while I was working for the university because they didn't pay me for my job, and I know this, and I literally lost access to my mental health services over the summer from it, right? Like, those are the things that should be included in a collegiate recovery program. Like, I should have access to a staff member who will help me advocate for that because it matters. It really matters. And just last week in my program, a student died from a totally preventable mental health related loss, right? And for HIPAA reasons, I will not share any further information, but I will say that is related to what we're talking about here, and they do not see that connection, and I promise you they don't, because I went to the memorial service and I stood in front of a room of administrators last week, and I was the only person aware that there was any amount of a recovery community on our campus, and the only person that mentioned it. And I had many people come up to me afterwards and say, "Oh, what's that? Oh, where'd that come from? How do I do that?" Well, it's been here for years, and people have been trying to get your attention. And I'm very tired of waiting for people to die before people are listening to us.
So, and thanks for that, all of you. And I'm wondering, as I hear you all share, what makes collegiate recovery necessary? Like, we're all here because maybe for a lot of folks here, this is a whole new thing, a whole new concept to them, right? And maybe in this space, like, collegiate recovery has never been uttered or whatever. But for us, it's a thing that we've engaged in. It's been a big part of our lives and even our livelihoods as a vocation, right? What makes it necessary? Like, why would a school want to have a collegiate recovery program? Why would we want to introduce collegiate recovery to an institution, whether it be a 2-year school, a 4-year school, or any institution of higher education?
I'll definitely I can kick things off. I think that in this day and age, we are all, and by this I mean, society at large, is looking for solutions to the addiction crisis that has been happening really since the war on, I would say, probably even before the war on drugs. But I think really magnified lately, right? It's definitely in the headlines, and we see it all the time. And so whether you're a policymaker or whether you're a college administrator or whether you're a student, I think we all want to be a part of the solution to the addiction crisis that is facing our nation. And so I think, in my opinion, collegiate recovery programs are just one very small solution to the addiction crisis, but I think they're an important one. I think that the more that you have students in the classroom on large Ivy League college universities talking about their experiences in recovery in the classrooms, so that it normalizes, because like it or not, the people at Columbia, the people at Stanford, those students are the ones that are going on to be tomorrow's policy makers. And so if we can include them in the classroom with people that are living with this experience or living with this condition, it does help to reduce stigma, because it's not just things that are happening en masse in Cass in Boston, or in Kensington in Philadelphia, or in the Tenderloin in San Francisco. It's something that is happening in the classroom of the college that they were in. And so I think that that is one way that they can just be one small solution to the addiction crisis.
Other folks?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll give you the academic answer, right? Like the fancy why it makes sense for your university to offer this, right? If you look at the research of Dr. Sierra Castedo de Mantel, she did a beautiful, beautiful research about the cost savings to institutions, right? That it increases retention of students. So it costs the university less money to, to replace students. Students in recovery tend to be more engaged in the institution. They tend to be student leaders. They tend to have higher GPAs. It's a cost savings, right? Because let's be honest, higher ed is about capitalism. Higher ed is about, it's about making money. And so that's the academic answer. But I will tell you why you want a student recovery or collegiate recovery community on your campus. Because you want the humans on your campus to thrive and be helpful, engaged human beings in their community. I'm not going to talk of productivity because you know what? I'm done with productivity, right? Like, I'm done with that. We need humans who are well and connected and engaged and thriving in their humanity to support the other humans in their communities and figure out cures and ways of making our communities better and reducing overdose risks and reducing the threat of addiction in our society. But you can't do that if the people aren't well and don't have the resources, the basic resources, right? Housing, food, community, and care to really thrive.
I'll add on a very tangible thing to demonstrate what Kristine is saying here, and what's been said is, when I was considering going back to college, as now, when I went back, I was 28, and I was sober at that time. And I see that very specifically because that was very important in my recovery at that moment. I could not be around. I was still too fragile personally in my recovery to be living with other people who were using substances. It would not have been okay for me at that time. That would have been very difficult. And I was terrified because coming back to a university, I'm from Michigan. I don't know New Jersey folks. I was like, I had nobody out here. My recovery community wasn't here. And yet this was where I wanted to go. This is the program. It was a music therapy program. It was the right school for me. But I was terrified about all of the other things that went around that. Like, who am I going to be friends with? Because I know that if I'm not in community as a person in recovery, I will go back to using. I know this, right? Who am I going to live with? Because literally, I cannot afford a 1-bedroom apartment around here. So I must find a roommate. And it has to be somebody who is going to be supportive of my recovery lifestyle. And preferably somebody who's not an 18-year-old. Even if that's the 18-year-old, but I was 28, right? Like, that's not the living situation that works for me. And all of those are things that, because I had never heard of collegiate recovery until I came to Montclair State University, those were terrifying questions that did not have answers in my head. I was wondering about financial, how am I going to support myself through school while I'm not only a full-time student, but also a full-time person in recovery. And anybody in recovery can attest that is a full-time commitment. That is a whole job. And I was so lucky that I found that collegiate recovery community, because here are some very practical things that a collegiate recovery community was able to provide for me. An immediate group of peers who were my same rough age and who were also in recovery and very different models of recovery. And I know that there's been a lot of talk about if harm reduction can coexist next to abstinence-based recovery. And let me tell you, I have lived it, and it absolutely can. It absolutely can. I ended up living with somebody that I met in that collegiate recovery community who is practicing harm reduction model of recovery, while I was still continuing to practice an abstinence-based model of recovery. And we held each other accountable in the best way for our various types of recovery. He was, totally different types of recovery, and we still supported each other, and it was incredible. And that's one of my best friends. I lived with him for 2 years. I found him through that collegiate recovery community, and I don't know what I would have done otherwise. I don't have to know, because luckily that was there. And also my first semester at Rutgers State University, Kristine and other staff that were helping to support our community had secured grant money specifically available to students who were in recovery, who could apply for that money. And that money was the difference between me having to take a second job or not, 100%. And because of that, I did just go to school and focus on my recovery. And that is why I was okay. Totally.
And it wasn't a lot of money. I think it was like $1,100 we gave to students. It wasn't a lot of money, but little things help.
So I would just add that I think that there is a moral imperative for universities to provide this, especially well-resourced universities. I got to VCU and we were getting $20 million plus a year in NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, and IAAA funding. And I mean, not just, and we have a big medical center, not just we didn't have collegiate recovery, but we had 2 people in the whole, we have 20,000 employees, like we have a large medical operation. There's 2 employees dedicated to substance use in the whole organization, right? And I mean, that is a complete failure morally, and that has started to shift. And I mean, I think we've been part of the pressure there, because we said, no, you can't, this is not acceptable. It's not acceptable. And in part because we have voices of recovery on our campus that are saying it's not acceptable. The other thing is the data is really clear that people that go to institutions of higher education use substances at higher rates than people who do not, right? Or specifically alcohol, right? And so literally the school is actively creating an environment or not disrupting an environment that is extremely supportive of substance use. So the least that colleges and universities could do is to provide some level of support for students with severe substance use disorders and make an effort to create a community, because those students are on every campus. And there's also students who are actively trying to make changes in their substance use on every campus. And there's some campuses that those students convert to people in recovery. And there's some campuses where those students drop out. They struggle their whole time. They go on to struggle for a lot longer. And so, again, I think there's just a moral imperative around it.
And I would say there's an ethical imperative around it as well, right? Like, these are places in which cause profound amounts of stress. And we talk about students with severe substance use disorders, but there's students with mild and moderate substance use disorders. And if we're not engaging in programming that supports them, we are then adding to the reality that they may become students with severe substance use disorders, or people, because they can no longer remain in their student status, right? So I think, and true, right? There's generally 2 people on most campuses who do substance use work. There's some rando like me who works in the counseling center, and everyone thinks, what's wrong with them? Why do you do this work? No exaggeration. Like, oh, you're special. You deal with those people. No exaggeration at all. And then there's someone in health promotion. But we're talking about colleges of 10, 20, 30,000, and we know that about 20% of the population struggles with substance use. We are doing an ethical disservice on college campuses by not providing these kind of supports. It is ethically out of line for us not to be investing in these supports for our students and for the community at large, because let's be honest, faculty and staff also struggle, and there's not the supports there, and there's not the ability to talk honestly about substance use that is occurring and that is sanctioned by the university. Because let's all be honest, anybody who's worked on a college campus, you've gone to some sort of event where alcohol is being served. And I won't even talk when I work, we used to work with students in the art department. They would talk to us, our students in recovery would talk to us about the drugs that were always floating around at these events as well. Not sanctioned by the university, the drug use, but it was there. So we need to be really thoughtful and intentional about talking about the services that colleges provide, both for students with substance use issues and in general, because they're deeply intertwined.
So, thank you, because one of the things that we don't often get a chance to talk about is one, student development, identity development, and then just brain maturation, the environment in which the university operates. And I think of something that Tom said to me a while ago. So Tom, things you say to me stick for good or for ill. College is the place. What did you say? You said college is the place, has the worst place for mental health. Just how it's designed, how it's set up, the conditions for people to learn, the pressures that are put on young people who are coming from a structured environment to a less structured environment to have the pressures. And then I think, Morgan, somebody hinted at medical school, 80-hour a week, the whole way a higher ed is set up is just not conducive to actually supporting people to actually be well all together. We talked about self-care earlier. But I want to go and pivot into something here. And Noel, you really hinted at something about collegiate recovery programs. In spite of their growth, exponential growth, we've seen so many schools develop collegiate recovery programs. But I feel like what you were saying, as a part of the larger solution to our current overdose addiction crisis where we are, how does it fit in, specifically? Because higher ed is often isolated. And it's kind of separated from the larger, intentionally or unintentionally, from the larger society. But how can collegiate recovery, and knowing some of your journey and how you got to where you are today, can you talk about making a better link with collegiate recovery to maybe folks in the larger community who are struggling with substance use or who are seeking recovery?
Yeah, and I don't know that I have a perfect answer. I just know that, you can have conversations with, pretty much anyone, and you can ask them what are the top 5 things that are affecting our community? It doesn't matter where we live, right? Any college anywhere on this, in this country you can go to, and one of the top 5 things is always addiction. It's either, it's just not hard to kind of find that. So I don't think that link is hard to make. I think it gets clouded in a lot of other kinds of things that are happening. And, it was brought up in the last one. We live in this highly polarized political climate that is very difficult to not take sides on. With everything, it seems like we're taking sides on. And so, I don't have a great answer. I just know that collegiate recovery has a role in providing some of these solutions. I think that you could, one avenue would be in workforce development. There's this huge need for peers in all of the work that we're doing, and so we need to have a way to train peers to do that. And what I find is that people in recovery love to kind of give back or help, reach back with a helping hand. And so that's just one area, but I think there are many.
I'd love to add to that, because I think the workforce development piece is really a really powerful argument to me for the existence of collegiate recovery programs, and a big piece of why I still work in collegiate recovery, and why I love to work in collegiate recovery, is because when students who are in recovery are not have enough support that they're not just fighting for their own recovery, they are actively really helping out the other students in recovery on their campus. So there's a huge value add there, and more people will stay in recovery and sustain their recovery because that student's energy is freed up by having safety in their own community. But also And this is not just true of folks that are going into the addiction recovery field, because frankly, like we've had that for decades, right? Where the addiction recovery field has been filled with folks in recovery and were able to kind of combine personal recovery experience with their education and thus be equipped to go out and work in the field. But I think one of the special things we have in collegiate recovery is that people that are doing a whole bunch of other things or are interested in doing a whole bunch of other things have this supportive environment where they can try out being all of who they are and potentially going to work at a place that have historically, it's not been okay for them to be out about their recovery and say, you know what, I'm a person in recovery and we need to do X, Y, or Z differently. I mean, we see this, and I have all kinds of, folks that I know that are, have been social workers for 20 years, have been in recovery for whatever, 22, 24. And it was never acceptable for them to be out as people in recovery in their jobs. What a huge loss for their organizations, for our communities, that person was never supported enough in their identity to say, this is who I am, and like, hey, this is part of my experience and you can benefit from that. Or, any workplace having people out. And I know at least since I've been at VCU, there's at least 10 people on faculty or staff who set up a meeting with me and kind of soon after got into stable recovery, right? And that's because I'm an out person in recovery on our campus, right? It's not anything special. It's just like, oh yeah, why don't you meet these couple of people? And they got them to where they are. So there's this real value add in having people in recovery pursuing their education that that are learning that it's okay to be out about their recovery and they can walk through. They're going to get some bullshit responses from people, excuse my language, about like, oh, you shouldn't share that. But what I find is that most of our students end up being like, you know what, I'm just going to be who I am. And there's tremendous, tremendous benefit to our communities when people can be all of who they are.
All right, let me go here and be super, super real. And Caleb, I see you. So in my experience, people do that, shit's going to happen, right? So just, and I'm really bringing this up, and it really goes back to the question that I was really going at with Noel, because Noel, if I Google you, right, which I did, not to be weird, your whole story, right, and I don't want to be the one to tell your story, but it's here, and what I was getting at was what you were talking, like how you got to collegiate recovery, like where your entry point was and what collegiate recovery or the idea of going to college did for you because of your background. Now, for me, and I will safely say that a lot of people that go to collegiate recovery programs have really shitty experiences, right, with the criminal legal system. So that's where I was getting at. And can you talk about that experience as the link?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I didn't share that when I got out of prison, my goal was to be a drug and alcohol counselor. And for reasons that Tom just illustrated very well, I realized very, very quickly once I became a drug and alcohol counselor that that was not a role that was going to be a good one for me. I found that the role of substance use counselor in this country, at least, is so overshadowed by the war on drugs and stigma that I just felt like the therapeutic alliance that I had really wasn't even there at all. And so, I kind of kept going to school. And again, I was very lucky. I went to college in the state of Washington. We have ban the box laws. There's many states that don't have that, that you can't even go to college, right? Your application gets immediately thrown out through a checkbox. And so, I didn't have those experiences. And as I realized that other places did have those experiences, I've always tried to not take that for granted. And so, I've always kind of worked around Ban the Box, and as I entered into collegiate recovery, every place that I've gone to didn't have collegiate recovery when I got there, and so whether that was Washington State or Stanford or now BU, none of them had collegiate recovery, and so. I think taking both of those identities, being a person in recovery and then being a person that is formerly incarcerated, and even in my research world, Tom, bless his heart, the people at VCU, very, very graciously made their data kind of publicly available as long as you could kind of show that you were going to use it for. And so, just with that data, we've shown some of the impacts of being formerly incarcerated and what that means in collegiate recovery, and a lot of more work to do there. But I take, I think, both identities with me wherever I go, and always try and be thinking through the lens of both of them, because it is important. It's important to understand that, in this country, many, many times, as evident by the last panel, the result of addiction in this country is involvement with the criminal justice system. And so, really taking that into account, that these collegiate recovery programs are going to have people that are involved or have some involvement with the criminal justice system. What are we doing to help those individuals? And what are we doing to make those individuals feel welcome within our collegiate recovery programs is always something that is front and center in my mind.
Thank you for that. That's what I was getting at before.
Okay.
I was trying to steer you all away from that academic stuff. I'm getting with the workforce, but I've got more. But caffeine is starting to roll.
Yeah, Ban the Box. So there's Ban the Box in 4 different areas that I've seen, right? So Ban the Box in employment would be basically legislation that requires either states or municipalities to remove the criminal history box from any type of application. So there's Ban the Box in housing, in employment, in occupational licenses, and then in college applications. And so there are currently 7 states that have moved to ban the box from college applications, which again, those laws and rules or policies are rooted in the war on drugs, and they actually are not rooted in research at all. There's no research to show that colleges that have the criminal history box are more safe than colleges that don't. And so, anyways, we could talk on that more later, but very important.
Yeah, but that's going to go into my next question, which is thank you for that. And Caleb,
I was just, I was going to go back to the connection with the community, right? And how symbiotic it really is. And to say, the reason that I even need to look for a collegiate recovery community in the first place was because I had heard from recovery friends of mine that existed in my recovery community outside of higher education that, hey, you might want to look at the counseling and psychological services to see if they have support for students in recovery. I wouldn't have known that, right? But then in return, I've been able to share that same information with other folks in recovery that I know who are considering going back to an institution for further education, right? Saying, hey, maybe you should look at this aspect of choosing the place that you might want to go to school. And also thinking about, just the broader, what recovery really means. I think anybody who has spent time in a recovery space, whether you are a person in recovery or just an advocate or an ally, it is so much more than just about changing your relationship to substance use, right? Like that's the core for a lot of people that brings them there, but that very much becomes a total reexamination for a lot of folks. I can only speak for myself, and I want to make sure I am. So I'm just, in my experience, that was what brought me there. But what I learned was how to reconnect to my community. I mean, that is what recovery has taught me, is how to rediscover who I am and how I can be a part of my community. Hands down, 100%. That is what recovery is. To me, the opposite of addiction is community. That is the opposite. And, from being in collegiate recovery community, I got an internship with a national organization that taught me how to look at and learn about state level policies that are happening in regards to where these funds are going, federal policies that are happening in regards to where these funds are going. Those are things I didn't know about before, and that I'm now going to be involved in for the rest of my life. The organization that I was talking about that I direct, I mean, that is literally sending students out to work with people in the community who are dealing with these same challenges. When I showed up to my teaching placement last year and identified as a person in recovery to a group of students who were also mostly in recovery, that was everything, and we have that here. Like, we have students who want to do that work as well. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So now I'm going to pivot into a question that's kind of linked to all the things that we've been talking about. This is a big question, and I put here, it's loaded. So how can a CRP be an instrument to disrupt, dismantle, and offer reparations for those impacted by the harms higher education has done to those impacted by the war on marginalized people? Yes, I did that. That is a Blue Book question. I'm dating myself too for Blue Book. So, do you want me to go there with the question again? Because we've all been hinting at it, and the work that what collegiate recovery programs can be within the institution, and then also connections with the larger community. So I don't see collegiate recovery being a small thing, but often like a big thing, a bridge. Go ahead, Kristine.
There's so many nuances to that question. I feel like you asked 15 questions in one, Keith.
ADHD.
Right? Like, I mean, so if we look at collegiate recovery as an institution, not institutionally, but as an institution, there's a lot of work to do, because collegiate recovery is very rooted in privilege on access, right? If you look at students who are generally, and Noel, you can speak to this, I think, more eloquently than I can, but I believe it's around 90% of the students who are involved in collegiate recovery are Euro-American identified. So if we stop there for a second, there's a whole lot of work to do, right? People need to step back, understand how they even got to that place of being higher education, and really do some reflection about how their privileges and history have allowed them access to spaces, and why there aren't people who are from backgrounds like I am, Latin, African American, Black, Asian, and disabled, like all those other minoritized communities in the nation, why they are not largely parts of these communities. So I think before we can even talk about reparations, we need to talk about self-reflection and self-understanding, right? I think there's so much work to be done in the community before they can even advocate to do better outside of the community, because it's a hot mess.
I agree, yeah, because CRPs can be a mirror to the university. But Caleb, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add to that, I think I've heard even from folks up here who are maybe involved with collegiate recovery programs is, maybe not currently, but even just in the beginning, short staff, or the low amount of people who are actually available to help facilitate this community or to help offer guidance. And I guess what I'm getting at is that the more robust of a program that you build, the more you have the space to have more nuanced conversations about this. And we have then the resources not to just be like literally making sure somebody isn't dying right that moment, but that we can then also dedicate resources and energy and space and time to having conversations that really do get people engaged in the larger conversations that matter in their own understanding of themselves as a person with recovery. I mean, these are things that I think a lot of folks in recovery for themselves don't even have a space to really think about, right? So just building a large enough space that there is room for this kind of work to even be happening.
Yeah, I don't know that there's any easy solutions. I think that I've definitely been around some colleges lately, and the thing is, like, there is they're grounded in systemic white supremacy. But in order to have a language that's more palatable to, I think sometimes people that are in charge, when you start throwing around words like white supremacy and abolition and things like that I identify with, I've been confirmed by other people, and they've asked me to make these terms more palatable in these spaces, and it's hard work. And I think that there are colleges out there that aren't ready to do the work. I talked to colleagues in Florida, and it's not even that they're not ready to do the work. They're absolutely scared to death to do the work. And so I think collegiate recovery can have a huge voice in that. I don't know the exact solutions, but luckily I see a lot of students, and I'm really, really hopeful for the next generation. I think my generation has really let me down in a large way, and so I'm really, really hopeful for the next generation kind of coming up behind us that I see being able to change the world.
The only thing I'd add is like reparations about real resources, and there's a lot of work to do within collegiate recovery, and the bigger money, the bigger impact is outside of collegiate recovery. And so, we have this to some extent with our program and some of our statewide services in terms of scholarships, specifically for folks in recovery. But I think that we need real investment. Kristine mentioned Sierra's research, and what's interesting about that research too is that there's institutional benefit from students in recovery, but the bigger benefit is the state kind of and federal level benefit, right? If you think about the difference between a person in active addiction, right, and a person with a college degree who's in recovery, if you're going to talk about it from a crass economic standpoint, like it's a huge difference in tax dollars, right? Like that then continues year after year after year after year. And so, to me, like I'm talking about like real scholarship money that covers all of people's tuition is where we need to be, especially for the people most affected by the drug war. And so that means folks that are formerly incarcerated, especially folks that have, a history with severe substance use disorder. And we actually do this around other disabilities, right? Like where we have special access available for folks. And so I don't think it's a little bit crazy, but it's not that crazy to say like, hey, like our universities, our institutions, and our society at large would be vastly improved by huge and real investment in people that have this lived experience. I think that would go a long way. I think collegiate recovery programs would change pretty dramatically in terms of the makeup and in terms of how it's a better space for everyone because more people would have access. But that's something that really comes to mind for me, and it would push schools to really make good on a promise to be, open places for everyone in our community.
I think the piece that we're not addressing concretely, we're addressing it in a roundabout way, is the difference coming at it from a capitalist perspective versus a humanist perspective. And so, I think Noel's point, and I sit with it, and I'm like, oh, damn it, white comfort really fucks shit up. I'm sorry, and I'm sorry to be so crass about it, but like, if we want to make truly systemic changes, we have to honor and acknowledge that white supremacy supports capitalism, and as long as we're, thinking about it from a solely economic perspective, we're going to get similar results to what we have. Until we can pivot and see people from a humanist perspective and address the harms that we have caused by capitalism and the war on drugs, because they're directly linked, right? Until we start having intentional conversations, until we start really picking out things from the weeds and really looking at the underpinning of how we got to where we are historically, we're not going to create any meaningful change, right? Collegiate recovery is going to remain largely the same. And so I think I'm a person who's like, sometimes we have to tear shit down and build it from scratch to do something differently. And I think until academic institutions or this country, because let's be honest, to Noel's point, there are places in this country having this conversation is illegal, right? Like, put me in Florida. That's why I don't go visit my family down there. I'm not working, right? Like, so we need to understand that this is a systemic issue. And it's not any one particular collegiate recovery community. It's not even the field of collegiate recovery. Yes, they definitely play into it. Please don't get me wrong. But it's a larger systemic issue that until we think about it from a grassroots level, we're not going to create change in the ways that we desperately need, particularly when addressing the war on drugs and the way it plays out in higher education.
So how can collegiate recovery programs help us talk about people who use drugs on campus in a different and a healthier, more effective way? Or even, did I say, even a more pleasurable way?
Can we just be honest and say that everyone on a college campus uses drugs?
No, because that's not necessarily true.
So if you use caffeine, you use drugs.
Still not necessarily true.
If you use an Advil,
I hear what you're saying, but it's still not necessarily true. And still doesn't take away from the point
right,
that we can still have a better conversation about drugs and how drugs are braided into our society. So I'm pushing back a little bit because there are students who don't engage in
I've never taken Advil or a Tylenol.
Yeah, and for whatever reasons, that's just not their jam. And I want to honor them and respect them too while we're having this conversation, but understand that, like, this is all part of a larger health conversation that we need to have on our college campuses. This is maybe my only soapbox moment. So
I love the soapbox.
So one of the things that I really would love for us to talk about, and I think collegiate recovery programs are positioned to maybe talk about this, is that we can actually talk about substance use in the same way that we talk about sex on campus. It is something that's pleasurable that people do. That doesn't mean that excludes the necessity of a collegiate recovery program. People need healing in different spaces, but we need an opportunity to maybe change the dialogue. And one of the things that's underneath all the stuff that we're talking about, ableism is built in. How do we talk about disabilities? How do we talk about how people who are the most marginalized have to be the most ardent advocates for change on campus? These are the things that we're talking about, how we have to expose ourselves in order for people to believe our pain. So what's underneath, again, all of this conversation is whose pain matters, right? Who do we choose to see, on a college campus? And for a long time, the idea was just like, those kids do drugs. It's like, and to your ethical point, and I think about all the work, it's just like the university sets up an atmosphere that's a room full of razor blades and then blames kids for getting cut. And then we have student conduct and we're like, why did you get cut? We set up this perfect place for you to have, to play, and then we're punishing folks. And then we have a system where we impose fines, and then we try and get them to come in, and then we become an agent of the police state. I won't go into my role as a therapist and the counseling center and how we surveil folks. So for me, collegiate recovery programs is really something dynamic and can be totally different, and that it snatches the idea of health and wellness from, quote unquote, the experts and makes it a community thing. So long story short, how can collegiate recovery programs be that space that we can talk about things differently?
I would love to kick it off.
Please do, Caleb.
I'm thinking actually of a meeting that happened last week with our Columbia students that are the Columbia Recovery Coalition, which is that group I was talking about earlier that really needs institutional backing, right? But we had somebody from the Ask Alice services come to our last meeting last week, or I guess it was one this week. I did not attend, but last week somebody from the Ask Alice Center came, and that is a confidential resource available to students on campus. And, it is staffed by mental health care professionals and peer recovery support specialists and, folks who are recovery adjacent. And we had a conversation with the person there about why should both things exist, right? Here's a mental health space already set up. And I think she said it so beautifully. And so I'm just going to steal what she said. And it's basically that a program like Ask Alice is a really wonderful place for students to go when they would like to remain confidential about their recovery, when they would like to be able to access resources, but really not need to talk openly about what they're struggling with, right? Students need a space where they can go be with other folks who are openly identifying as people in a recovery community, because that's how we reduce shame. That's how we reduce stigma. That's how we promote visibility. There's a huge difference between somebody who only sees resources that are confidential, that are set up to be secret, that are set up to be something that nobody has to know about. Like, that sends a message that all of those services are meant to keep this hidden away, right? There's a totally different need that exists where students need to be able to feel like they can own their identity. I think I heard you say, like, taking back, what our community is, and being able to actually have autonomy in that, and being able to, as our own student community, have a say in who we are and what we're talking about and what we're asking for and how we present ourselves, and right now there is no space for that.
I'll just say, like, Zico's involved in our community, right? And so our students know Zico. What a tremendous asset. What a totally getting to be in seminar on a regular basis with somebody that has this professional experience, this life experience. Like, it's a total game changer for people's perspectives. Now I have students coming to me, they're saying, like, why aren't we giving out fentanyl test strips and doing needle exchange on campus, right? So our students in recovery are awesome and benefit from knowing each other, right? And that pushes them to think about things in different ways and to lead conversations on our campus in different ways.
Thanks. Folks, anything?
No, I think they did a great job of really encapsulating.
Thanks. And Noel, so one of the things that maybe one a few times I'll say something about Rutgers. So there's the Rutgers Addiction Research Center on campus. Danielle Dick is the in charge of it. That's her jam right now. And one of the things that we've noticed for a long time, that there has not been a connection, sadly, at a major research institution at Rutgers between the back end, which is literally the back end of campus, to student affairs. Can you talk a little bit about how stigma may show up or stop the research part from connecting with the student affairs part, where I'm working with students who have, substance use issues and other concerns, but the information is slow to come from the back to the front. Can you talk about maybe how stigma?
This is definitely the norm, not an exception to the rule. This is, I would say, the case on pretty much all campuses. To Tom's point earlier, every school, with collegiate recovery programs and without collegiate recovery programs, take in millions and millions of dollars in funding for research from NIAAA, from NIDA, from National Institute of Mental Health, and they don't feel this ethical responsibility to treat their own students that have this condition, and it's a huge disconnect. And I think that there's a couple of things, and these are probably pretty evident to, I think, everyone here. The war on drugs has really tainted everybody's in here's their mental picture of what addiction is and who it affects, and how we deal with it in this country. And I think that's something that's not talked about as much, but so evident on college campuses is the effect. And because so much of it is subliminal, We don't even realize it's happening, but the effect of this $7 billion arm of the alcohol marketing industry. Every time you see a study that says that drinking wine is good for you, or every time, I mean, this is all planted information from the from the alcohol industry to shade things, to make everyone think it's gray, or that the researchers can't decide on this, and so it has painted this picture from the moment everyone in here was born. We turned 7, 8 years old. We can't wait for our 21st birthday. There's no reason for that. I mean, there's no reason other than the influence of the alcohol industry. It is a point in time that should be no different than any other birthday that we have, but we treat it as though it's Christmas, and all of the same kind of built into one, and that is the subliminal influence of the alcohol industry, and it happens to us every single day, and we're not even realizing that it's happening because the alcohol industry is so good at this point in using this subliminal messaging to us, and it's rampant on college campuses.
Yeah, I just point this out. So how do you know this is not a beer? Because it has nutritional facts on it, even though it's seltzer water, right? So speaking of the alcohol industry, right? Like, when you look at your alcohol, it does not have serving size. It does not have nutritional facts, right? Like, it's crazy, right? Like, that's exactly what, we don't think about that, but I know this is not a beer because it has nutritional facts on it, right? That's wild.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. I saw yesterday. I get messages because I used to go to Stanford football games, and the message on there was, and I never asked for it. I don't know who would have, but it says, "You asked for it, you got it. We now serve alcohol at Stanford football games." And these go out to every student that gets tickets. I was just a student that got tickets, and so this again, that's just one small example of the way that it works on college campuses.
Go ahead, Kristine, and thank you for that. And
Yeah, I'm really struck on the whole, and I really appreciate you talking about alcohol versus drugs. And when I think about research, I think about, and I am not a researcher, I am a PsyD, right? So like, research is definitely not my strong suit. I do it, but it's not my strong suit. But I in my head, when I think about research, I think about the problem, and alcohol isn't the problem. It is. I'm not saying it isn't, right? But from a perspective, like from a back end perspective, Keith, right? And I'm not a researcher, so Noel, please hop on in here. But when I think about research, I'm thinking about there's a problem and we're trying to understand the problem so we can create a solution. Right? And so alcohol, again, because it's a socially sanctioned drug, right? It's a drug that we celebrate on our college campuses. It's a drug that, it's interesting. When we look at overdose rates, we very rarely look at alcohol overdose rates. I mean, we never talk about it, right? Very intentionally. And so I think when you ask about research, I'm just like, oh, there's so much there to talk about, and so much that we're very intentionally not talking about in terms of who's doing the research, where the research is being produced, why the research is being produced. And we have to ask questions, lots of questions, if we want intelligent answers. But the thing is, we don't actually want intelligent answers.
Wow. So we went there today, which is great. So first thing I always ask is like, who benefits, how, right? That's always the thing. Who benefits with anything? And the funny thing, or at least the irony here, and no, thank you for talking about at least the alcohol piece, is still being the chief offender on college campuses, something that is definitely overlooked, and how we call, overdoses as they're related to opioids, something different than alcohol poisonings, because both technically are poisonings, right? But how they're written up in terms of like as they're related to like police reports, EMS transports, and how students are dealt with two totally different things. I'm going to get, hold on, one thing. I see you. I see you. I see you.